for the afternoon. My name is Patrick Juma. We're here to celebrate and look into, if you like, a little bit more detail the role that black African soldiers had in the World War I. And we've got an exciting action-packed sort of afternoon where we'll have various talks and presentations by different individuals. We've got some really technical sessions. We've got some arts and show where you'll be able to actually see visual pictures from some of the stuff that I'll discuss. And I really hope that you'll find this beneficial. But before we continue, I'd just like to ask everyone if you could please either put your phones off or on vibrate or on silent, so that we're able to work through the program. And also just for health and safety, we've got our men's and our gents to my left. So as you come out of the door to your left, straight down, you'll be able to find the men's and the ladies, sorry. And apart from that, I hope we enjoy ourselves. Without further ado, I don't know if you all have time to say hi to each other. Maybe just turn to your left and right and say hi, or Mbote, Mingala, if they say hi. Yeah, the person sitting next to you is your friend. Introduce yourselves. And without further ado, I would like to call our two first presenters, the lovely Bernadette and Kelvin. If you could please come forward and encourage them if you can with...
Good afternoon. My name is Kaveen, and we have been working on black African soldiers in the British West Indian Regiment during the First World War. The First World War was truly a war with life contributions from men all around the world. Many black communities feel detached from remembrance of this period due to a lack of personal relation to the war that truly changed the world. Little do black communities know that World War I could not have been won without the forgotten heroes of the West Indian Regiment, mainly consisting of black African soldiers who triumphed against German forces in Cameroon, present-day Togo, East Africa, despite challenging conditions. In absence of food, supplies, clothing, and in the face of exposure, malaria, the West Indian Regiment found strength to champion against all odds. In their fighting spirits and unimaginable sacrifices have yet to be known and honoured by their descendants and the rest of the world. In this project, we aim to tell the tale of the real unsung heroes of World War I and our ancestors, the men of the West Indian Regiment. This is what we have learnt so far.
So continuing from what Kevin said, after realising that there was a story which needed to be shared, so First World War I, when you hear it, you know about Germany, you know about Britain's part, you know about the Allies, but you don't actually think about the involvement, for example, of the British African soldiers and the West Indian Regiment. So clearly there's a gap in history which kind of needs to be shared and which needs to be filled. So in light with the project, the first activity we did, we went to the Imperial War Museum. So there we went with a speaker who works in cultural heritage, and he gave us the task of going through all the different exhibitions inside the Imperial War Museum and trying to find things that are related to British African soldiers or the West Indian Regiment. And that was actually a hard task, I must say. We did find a few exhibitions lying on top of maybe tables. There were small pictures, but they were quite hidden and the story wasn't really told. It did spark an interest, however, and it led us to continue on to other workshops where we developed our knowledge on the British West Indian Regiment, and we realised that there is actually a story to be told, hence why a lot of us are here today to find out more. And today we've got an exhibition for you at the end as well. So I don't know if you've noticed, but to your left there's some pictures from what we found in the Imperial War Museum, so things related to the African soldiers and to the West Indian Regiment, and also images from after our workshops. So when we were learning about Africa and the role that it played, not just in terms of the British involvement, so Ghana, as my colleague described, Ghana, Togo, not just, Ghana and Nigeria, but also Germany, who had British African soldiers fighting on their part, so Togoland, for example. So that is a first image of some of us who first attended the Imperial War Museum, so you can see quite a few of us there. That's a typical place everyone goes to stand for pictures. And this is just a little insight about what's to come. So when we first started looking, I must admit my first thought was that all the involvement of, I guess, maybe British, in terms of African involvement, might be just as labourers, but I was actually wrong. This is one of the involvements. Yes, there was labourers who were helping with cleaning and various other activities, but there was also involvement of the actual British Empire. So a lot of British Empire had actually respect for Britain and gave lots of gifts to show their support to Britain. So it has a list of all the different countries, so ranging from Trinidad to Gambia to Nigeria to Hong Kong, and the various gifts that they gifted Britain. And whilst we were in the Imperial War Museum as well, so we saw actual photos of soldiers who were fighting. So it wasn't just labourers, it was soldiers involved not just in Africa as well, but this picture shows them involved in the Somme battle, so France. And as well, I'm a woman, so I was interested to see what was the role of women in the war as well. And in Africa, there was a lot of women, for example, who would be selling food and providing drinks for when the soldiers needed to rest. So this was happening across many different places in Africa. So hopefully the talks today will build up on your knowledge about the First World War, but give you maybe a different perspective that you haven't come across before. So I hope you enjoy what's to come. And at the end, the exhibitions will be there, and then myself and the other people who went to the museum hopefully will be there to answer your questions about the pictures we took and any other talks that you want to engage in. Thank you.
Thank you to both Benedict and Kelvin. I think without further ado, we're going to quickly move on to our next speaker. I would like to give him an introduction, but I think he'll probably do a better account of himself. So, Professor?
I'm not a professor quite yet. Let me get the... Okay. I don't usually have a mic like this. Can everybody hear okay? Is that okay? Okay, so I'm Richard Smith. I'm from Goldsmiths College in South London. It's part of the University of London. And I guess looking at the role of the West India Regiment and the British West Indies Regiment in the First World War has been take up a large part of my life for the last 20 years or so. So what I wanted to do today was just to provide some kind of backstory really to how did West Indians of African descent and people from the West India Regiment, which was a very long established historical regiment, how did they come to be fighting in Africa during the First World War? So just to provide a bit of a backstory really, to fill in perhaps some of the information that isn't always evident when you go to the Imperial War Museum. As Benedict and Kaveen have already said, that you have to kind of look for what we might call hidden traces of the participation of Africans and West Indians when you go to that museum, even though they spent about 20 million or so pounds refurbishing it. Finding images and photographs and little artefacts such as the chocolate boxes that were sent from the Caribbean to the soldiers serving on the Western Front and so forth. You have to struggle to kind of find those artefacts, don't you, in that huge big exhibition space. But one of the things people often forget is the fact that throughout the history of the British Empire was using African soldiers, and most famously as part of the West India Regiment. And the West India Regiment was initially recruited from men who had been emancipated from slavery. So they were often people who had been freed from slaves on the journey from Africa to the Caribbean. Sometimes the British Navy would intercept the slave ship and the men would be forcibly conscripted into the West India Regiment. And that regiment was founded in 1795, during which time France was having a revolution and a lot of the islands in the Caribbean were being fought over between Britain and France, and Britain relied very heavily on the soldiers of the West India Regiment to fight on Britain's behalf, because those African soldiers were essentially better able to fight in the conditions and were better able to resist some of the diseases such as malaria. The Caribbean was known as the white man's graveyard because literally thousands of British soldiers went to the Caribbean and died of disease before they even got a chance to fire their weapons. But nevertheless, so the West India Regiment is a really important historical regiment that was in existence for about 150 years. And you can see here, this Alfred Ferdinandis was an officer of the West India Regiment in the 19th century, and he really praised their ability to fight as soldiers. And for example, he said the favourite weapon of the West Indian soldier is the bayonet, and the principal difficulty is getting the West Indian soldier to hold back. So anxious is he to close with his enemy. So they were regarded as really important, brave fighting troops, well before the start of the First World War in 1914. And you can see here a photograph in the bottom. This is from the National Army Museum. It's a little bit blurry, but it's a very old photograph, over 100 years old. But it shows members of the West India Regiment when they were stationed in Sierra Leone in West Africa. And the West India Regiment alternated between the Caribbean and West Africa. And just before the First World War broke out, many West Indian soldiers were already stationed in Africa. And it's important to recognise that although the majority of the men recruited were from the Caribbean itself, so from Jamaica, Barbados and elsewhere in the Caribbean, local African men from Sierra Leone were also recruited directly into the West India Regiment at that time as well. So there was a historic African connection via the Caribbean, but also a local African connection directly from Sierra Leone itself. As I said, the West India Regiment was praised as very strong fighting force, and I think it's one of the abilities of the West Indian soldiers was often to be able to cope in conditions where white soldiers often died very quickly of disease. So I've got this image here. It's an image of 4 West Indian soldiers who were boxers. They actually fought for the West India Regiment as boxers, so in their spare time they were trained as athletes and sportsmen as well. And again, you can see from this image that from the point of view of the white officers, that the West Indian soldiers made very physically strong fighting men, which is a contrast to the way they were often treated in the First World War itself. When the war broke out in August 1914, was also a time of year in the Caribbean when people were celebrating the end of slavery. 1st of August 1914 was also Emancipation Day, as well as a short period, just only 4 or 5 days afterwards, the First World War broke out. But in the Caribbean, people were celebrating the end of slavery, which was only about 80 years previously. So you can imagine the people in the Caribbean have that memory of slavery very strong in their minds, and this is an important issue in terms of people then coming forward the British Empire. The image I've got there is a man in Jamaica standing on a street corner. He's waving the Union Jack, but one of the things he did was tell stories, stood on the street corner as a kind of orator, telling people around the local community what was happening in other parts of the world. So he would be somebody who'd read all the newspapers and he knew what was happening on the other side of the world in Europe, and that war was breaking out. And obviously this was one way that news of the war spread to people living in the Caribbean. As I suggested, this sense of slavery being not such a long time ago from the point of view of the Caribbean was something that the British in the Caribbean played on. And one of the things that they did to encourage people to volunteer was to say that if Germany wins the war, Germany is going to reimpose slavery in the Caribbean. So this encouraged people to come forward and volunteer for the West Indian forces when war had broken out. This notion that somehow the British sense of fair play that they apparently said existed would be overridden by what was called the mailed fist of Prussianism, this kind of notion of the Germans wanting to reimpose slavery and so forth. This was a kind of story that was put throughout the press in the Caribbean at that time. And German people living in the Caribbean were as a result sent to prison camps, as this image shows here. Another really important figure in terms of, I guess, Africans in the Caribbean, but all over the world, in the United States and in Africa itself, was the figure of Marcus Garvey. And in 1914, when the war broke out, he encouraged West Indians to come forward and volunteer, because again, he was perhaps fearful of what might happen if Germany won the war. And it's fair to say that over the course of the war, Marcus Garvey changed his position. He spoke less favourably, far less favourably about Britain. But in the early stages of the war, Marcus Garvey was really important in encouraging people to volunteer. He spoke very clearly and said that, you know, it was important that British forces were successful on the battlefield. And as you can see from this image here, this is a recruitment meeting in Jamaica, in Kingston, Jamaica, and lots of important local people went and made speeches. Religious figures, political figures, military figures had these big recruitment meetings, and you can see in the front row there's a row of Boy Scouts of both Jamaican and white Europeans who used to attend these rallies, and this was another important factor in encouraging people, younger people, to come forward and volunteer. They might already have a uniform as a Boy Scout and think, well, you know, the next step is to go and join the army. But these kind of rallies were really, really important, particularly, I guess, in encouraging, you know, Jamaicans and other people from the Caribbean to come forward. You know, don't let anybody call you a coward. It's important that you come forward and fight and do your bit for Jamaica. And the same sort of speeches were being made all over the Caribbean as well. Also important by 1915 was when the numbers of volunteers in Britain was declining. When war first broke out, large numbers of people went straight to the recruitment offices. You've probably seen those photographs, and you would have probably seen it at the War Museum, the photographs of thousands of men queuing up to enlist. By mid-1915, this sort of men had dried up, and Britain was struggling to find enough volunteers. And King George V, who was on the throne at that time, who is the grandfather of Elizabeth II, who's on the throne now, he made an important appeal throughout the British Empire, calling on people to come forward and volunteer. And this was particularly important in the context, again, of the Caribbean. And eventually the British West Indies Regiment was established by October 1915 after some opposition initially from the Colonial Office in London. The British West Indies Regiment was founded, in addition to the historic West India Regiment, which was already stationed in West Africa at that time. As you can see from this table here, something like 16,000 men came from all over the British West Indies, not only from the islands such as Jamaica, but from the mainland territories such as Guyana and Belize, which was then called British Honduras. So people from all over, a very large region. Not all of those islands are British islands, but certainly the islands of Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, as well as mainland countries such as Guyana, all sent men to fight, around 16,000 men. There's an image here of the Jamaican recruits being gathered on the parade ground at Up Park camp in Jamaica. But as you can see from this statement here, there was a sense that modern warfare meant that you had to be highly intelligent and highly skilled, and lots of people at that time had very racist opinions and suggested that the African recruits, the African soldiers and the West Indian soldiers did not have that capacity. And this is one reason why later on you see images of the West Indian soldiers doing jobs like carrying weapons. Okay. At that time there was a suggestion that the West Indian soldiers had to do labouring jobs rather than fight on the front line. So it's important to bear that in mind, that people had volunteered, they'd been encouraged to volunteer. People had said, we need men, we need people to come forward and volunteer. And when people actually did come forward and volunteer, they were often treated quite badly. And people said, oh, well, you're not good enough to be a frontline soldier. This was often something that was said. And some people were quite uncomfortable with the idea of African soldiers fighting in Europe, for example. Some people wrote quite unpleasant things, essentially, and even the British law of the time was quite equivocal. It wasn't entirely clear-cut whether it would actually allow black people to fight in the British Army. So lots of different messages that African and Caribbean soldiers are receiving. They're being encouraged to volunteer on one hand, and on the other hand there are attitudes and laws in place that discourage them from coming forward as well. So, complicated position. And when the West Indians arrived in Sussex on the south coast, it's a bit further on the coast than on the south coast, even some local people said, what on earth have you come to fight for Britain for? You have no interest in fighting for Britain, and even pointing out that the German Kaiser was actually a direct blood relation of George V. People often went to great lengths to cover up the fact that the British royal family and the German royal family were very closely related. And some people who opposed the war actually pointed that out to the West Indian soldiers and said, perhaps it's not a good idea to fight other people's wars for them. So, as I said, many West Indians ended up on the Western Front doing very dangerous work, carrying shells, building roads near the front line, laying barbed wire in the trenches, carrying wounded people away from the battlefield, but often not being able to fire guns and serve in the trenches themselves. But this changed when some of the West Indian battalions arrived in the Middle East, particularly in the later stages of the war. Britain in the Middle East was fighting the Turkish army, the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so that was seen as it was more acceptable for the West Indian soldiers to be fighting an enemy which was not seen as being. case of the Turkish army, was regarded as a non-white enemy, and that was often regarded as more acceptable for the West Indian soldiers raising their arms against them. And when the West Indian soldiers were deployed, it was clear that they did very well. You know, there were lots of reports being sent back from the Middle East, from Palestine and Israel and Syria, sent back to people in the Caribbean, saying that the West Indian troops had done exceptionally well, that they'd been very brave and they'd performed very well when they were subject to shell fire. In terms of Africa itself, as Benedict and Kaveen suggested, the West India Regiment, involved from the early days of the war, was already stationed in West Africa and moved down south from Sierra Leone to Cameroon, and was involved in October 1915. The West India Regiment was involved in some skirmishes, and again, when they were actually used in action, people praised their courage and said, they were subject to heavy machine gun fire, and their discipline and morale was excellent, all that could possibly be desired. So once black soldiers were actually deployed, people actually recognised that they made excellent soldiers. And this is an image here of the West India Regiment disembarking in Cameroon. And you can see, rather than the sort of tin hats that we associate with the First World War, they're wearing the kind of pith helmets that are more common when soldiers are fighting in tropical and desert conditions as well. I apologise for this lengthy bit of text here, but this is a kind of some details really about the second half of the First World War, by which time the West India Regiment and a small detachment of the British West Indies Regiment had moved to Tanganyika, which is now called Tanzania, but during the First World War was still a German colony. And the West India Regiment and a group of the British West Indies Regiment were sent there to take the German territories away. And as Benedict and Kaveen have already said, this was extremely difficult fighting conditions. It's essentially what we would call a guerrilla warfare situation, where the armies weren't particularly big, but they were involved in a climate where the people would often fall ill of malaria and other diseases. They were a long way from supply lines, so food was very difficult to get hold of. And one of the things that the army had to do in that situation was depend very, very heavily on the carrier corps. These were groups of African villages who were essentially recruited to work for the British Army. So about 1.5 million Africans during the course of the First World War were recruited essentially to provide supplies, carry all the weapons and heavy equipment through jungle conditions across the plains and so forth to keep the war effort going. So a very large number of Africans were involved in that part of the conflict, without whom the British Army just would not have been able to sustain its campaign. So that's an important hidden aspect of the African campaign, was the large numbers of Africans, and it wasn't just men, it was men, women and children who were used to carry the heavy equipment and heavy weapons through very difficult conditions, and that was throughout the duration of the war. As I said, the forces themselves were relatively small, but casualty rates were high, so if you didn't get wounded or killed by a rifle bullet or a machine gun bullet, there was a strong chance that you would die of disease. And if you were wounded, you often found yourself a very long way from medical support as well. So compared to the Western Front, which is often seen as mud and blood and shells raining down, at least if you got injured, you were quite close to being evacuated. You would quickly be removed from a battle scene and sent off home to England or to hospital in France. If you were wounded in Africa, your situation would be very much worse. And so the campaign itself, although it's a forgotten campaign, is very much a campaign which was, in terms of the demands it made upon the men, was a very extreme and arduous campaign. And at the end of it, in the Battle of Nyango, which resulted in Tanganyika being captured from Germany, again, the West India Regiment and the British West India Regiment soldiers who were involved were praised for their bravery, and they prevented, for example, some of the African carriers and the Cape Corps from southern Africa from fleeing the battlefield. Okay, so they managed not only to fight bravely themselves, but they also encouraged other people to fight bravely as well. But this image here is actually of some German askari. So these are African soldiers working for the German army. It's fair to say that many of these men were forcibly pressed into service. They weren't simply volunteers, they were often forcibly conscripted. That the Germans would have gone into a village and said, we need a certain number of men to fight for us. And to be honest, the British had a very similar approach as well. And some men even found themselves fighting on different sides, for both sides at some point in the conflicts. They might start off fighting for Germany, but then the British would enlist them later on. So it's a very complex, difficult fighting situation where, to some extent, the people living in places like Tanganyika found their lives totally disrupted and turned upside down by the fact that the Europeans were fighting a war there. Families might have found themselves, for example, fighting on different sides. So a very difficult conflict fighting. I just wanted to finish by looking, people often get the West India Regiment and the British West Indies Regiment confused, but as I said at the beginning, the West India Regiment was initially recruited from slaves and freed slaves in the late 18th century, and it had a very lengthy history and a lot of battle honours fighting for the British in West Africa throughout the 19th century. Okay, the British West Indies Regiment was formed for the duration of the war only, so it only existed during 1914 to 1919. And quite different groups of men joined both of these regiments. In terms of the West India Regiment, these were professional soldiers, so these were people who had enlisted, who had signed up to fight in the army for most of their working lives. So they might have signed up as a boy soldier of 15 or 16, started off as a drummer boy, and then they would have established a long career in the army, so they would become veterans in their 40s and even 50s. Okay, so they were essentially professional soldiers, the kind of soldiers that would join the British Army today. Whereas the British West Indies Regiment were entirely volunteers. Okay, these were men who at the outbreak of the war decided they wanted to fight as volunteers. And so in a sense, they saw themselves, each of those regiments saw themselves as very different. The West India Regiment regarded themselves as professionals, and to some extent looked down upon the British West Indies Regiment as amateur soldiers. And at one point, there was an attempt to make them into a single regimental organisation, and both groups of men said, if you force us to do that, we're going to mutiny, because actually we have our own regimental traditions with different groups of people. Some of us professional soldiers and some of us are amateur volunteers, and so the two organisations never joined together. The other complicating factor was that despite having a lengthy legacy of having served for the British Empire, the West India Regiment was regarded as what was called a native regiment. Okay? They were African soldiers. They were paid less money, received less allowances and so forth than white soldiers would have done in similar situations. And the British West Indies Regiment did not want to be called a native regiment, and that was another reason but they refused to be joined up with them. So, as you can hopefully, in this talk, I've given you a bit of an idea of the different motivations, what caused some people to volunteer. Sometimes when people volunteered, they were not treated very favourably, and also the different attitudes of soldiers towards each other as well. Okay, so I'll finish on that, and then Pauline's going to talk to you a bit about Chickapoys, the play about Jamaican soldiers from the First World War. Thank you. Soldiers, then that became seen as a problem, and one of the reasons that I guess officials in Britain were very quick to forget about the important contribution of soldiers from the Caribbean, India and Africa, despite the fact that in the war, if you open a newspaper during the war, there would often be a photograph of a soldier from the Caribbean or Africa or India, and even the Chinese labourers who came and fought for Britain. So there would, in the war itself, there was often a lot of coverage saying, you know, what a wonderful thing the British Empire is, and all these loyal subjects are coming to fight for us. But once people started saying they wanted fair and equal treatment, then people very quickly started to forget about them. So, yeah, it's a complicated picture. Yeah.
Thank you. Richard, I'd like to just ask in relation to where we are now, in particular to Brexit, given the sacrifice of the African Caribbean soldiers, would you consider it fair that those who are from Europe can just come in, or let's say willy-nilly, whereas those who have made the sacrifice are not able to do so? I don't think you've got a comment on that.
Again, how can I say, I think the Brexit issue, regardless of your position on it, it's re-highlighted some of the divisions in Britain as a society, and the fact that there's a long, long way still to go in terms of racial equality. And it's interesting how, you know, if you look at a newspaper such as The Guardian, for example, how quickly they have been to champion the citizenship rights of Europeans, and perhaps less quick to look at the much longer standing issues around citizen rights for black and Asian people who've lived in Britain for a much longer time. I think, you know, from my point of view, obviously everybody's citizenship rights need looking at, but I think, you know, the much longer legacy of people fighting for the Empire and Britain and working in Britain has to be looked at as well. So, having said that, on a personal level, I'm a pacifist, so I think it's a little bit problematic to say, well, to live in Britain you've got to fight for the country, because it's not always the right thing to do. And as we can see from the Caribbean soldiers who fought, sometimes they thought they were doing the right thing, and even at that time, the promises that were made, for example, well, if you go and fight for Jamaica, you're going to come home and have 5 acres of land and a cow, and you're going to have a plot of land to call your own. None of those promises were delivered, and people were essentially, I guess, duped to some extent to fighting for the Empire. At the same time, as I say, perhaps the number of lives that were needlessly lost and so forth is another important question that we have to ask ourselves. You know, large numbers of men from the Caribbean died needlessly. A lot of them died of disease because they weren't properly looked after, for example. So I have mixed feelings about, I don't think you have to fight for the country to have a right to live here. But again, that's a personal view.
I think we'll have time for just one last question.
My name is Odimba Kasende. I see you say that in October 1915, the West Indian soldier was involved in Cameroon. So, could you explain to me how that part of Africa become a French colony later on. And you say as well that many women, men and children was involved to carry stuff like vulture. I want to know exactly that children was volunteer or they bring them by force. Yeah, and Caribbean British soldiers, in which part of Africa they was involved in the war? Thank you.
Okay, so the reason that the West India Regiment went to Cameroon was that they were already stationed further up the West African coast in Sierra Leone. That was one of their military bases. Okay, so and one of the reasons the West India Regiment there was that historically the people in Sierra Leone had resisted British rule. And so, in fact, the West India Regiment was partly a local police force, and protecting the interests of the British. So that in a way, is a difficult part of that history. That was one reason the West India Regiment was stationed in West Africa. If you look at the Ashanti campaigns of the 1870s, you know, in what is now modern Ghana and in Gambia, and also in Sierra Leone in the 1890s, the West India Regiment was essentially fighting for the British Empire against local people. And in terms of Cameroon, they were sent there as a local part of the British Army, and as Cameroon at that time was a German colony and became a French colony after the peace settlement of 1919, when many parts of Africa that had belonged to Germany, such as Togo, Tanganyika and Namibia, were handed over to the French, British or Belgians as essentially as rewards. So, but the local people themselves, it's fair to say that they wouldn't have known an awful lot of difference between being ruled by Germany or Britain or France. You know, from the point of view of people living in those countries, you just exchange one white ruler for another. But essentially Cameroon was given as a prize to France and taken from Germany after the peace settlement of 1919. In terms of the carrier corps, some African people did volunteer to work for the carrier corps, but it's fair to say that the overwhelming majority were essentially conscripted. In other words, they would have been forced by the British would have gone into a village and said to a local headman, for example, or a local official in the village, we need 100 people to carry our supplies, and you've got to provide them. Otherwise, we're going to make life difficult. And it's fair to say that the war in Africa really totally disrupted the African economy, because it took people away from the land to carry goods for the British Army. You know, and while they were carrying supplies for Britain, that meant that they weren't growing food for them and so forth for themselves, or they were not looking after cattle. So the war in itself in Africa had a disastrous effect. There's a book called, I can't remember the author, I have to think, it's Edward Peace, I think. He wrote a book about Africa, The Forgotten Tragedy of the First World War. In outlines the impact of the First World War on Africa, and I guess the consequences of 1.5 million people being essentially taken from their towns and villages, away from their agriculture and livestock, and being forced to carry supplies for the British or the Germans, or feeding the British or German army. That hugely disrupted the African economy. And it's one of the aspects of the war that people still barely talk about. It's a huge impact that people don't discuss even to this day. So I always think, when we're talking about the fighting men, that's one important aspect, but the impact on the African economy and the African people at that time is another important aspect that we have to look at when we're looking at the role of people fighting in the First World War.
Caribbean soldiers were was involved in which part of Africa?
Okay, so as I said, they were always based before the First World War in Sierra Leone, and then in the war itself they fought in Cameroon in 1915, and then they were transferred to the east coast of Africa in what is now Tanzania, and Tanzania was then a German colony, and so the West India Regiment was important in making Tanzania a British colony, essentially.
Okay. Without further ado, I would like to bring forward our third session. I think she probably will give a better introduction of herself, but if you could please give your hands for Miss Pauline Walker.
Good afternoon. My name is Pauline Walker. I work for a company called Strongback Productions. And earlier this year we put on a play called Chickafoot Boys, which is about Jamaican soldiers in World War I. So I'm just going to talk through the project that we put together based on the history behind Chickafoot Boys, which is a play about the Caribbean and World War I. So our project was for young people aged between 15 and 22, and we ran 2 workshops for each group of participants. So when we put the project together, we thought it would be a unique opportunity for young people to learn about heritage, using the themes and the characters from the play as an inspiration to reflect on the contribution made by Caribbean soldiers to the war. And throughout the project, we were hoping that the young people would develop skills in research, and the outcomes of the project were to create an exhibition and a new website for themselves and for the public. So, at the first workshop, we had our experts, Dr. Richard Smith, Patricia Kumper, who wrote the play, and a filmmaker from Three Blokes Productions. And we've run 2 sets of workshops during August, actually, with Croydon Supplementary Education Partnership and WAC Arts, which is based up in Belsize Park. So Richard provided the historical context behind the war. So in the same way that he just given a presentation about the war, he gave a presentation to the young people. He presented the facts and figures of how many soldiers from the Caribbean went to fight in the war, and Britain's relationship with her colonies, and why the men from the Caribbean wanted to go and fight. And then he gave tips to the participants on how to do their own research. Pat Kumper, she also, as she wrote the play, she did her research both in the UK and also in Jamaica. And she gave a presentation about why she wanted to write this play, why it was important, why art should be used to tell people about their heritage, so they can learn about their heritage. And also because we're in the centenary of World War I, the UK is actually celebrating, commemorating. She didn't want their stories to be lost, so it's very important for her that she actually wrote this story. And you can see some images that she got from her research in Jamaica. As part of the production, we actually produced what we called an education resource pack. So it's a pack that schools or universities or anybody who's interested in theatre, working in theatre, anybody who's interested in drama, anybody who's interested in history, and anybody who's interested in English, actually, because you have to write. We produced a education resource pack, which is on our website. So that's our website address. You can download it. And also, I should say that there are about 14 copies of the play here. So whoever gets them first when we're finished, they're for you to keep and take away. So part of the project that we asked young people to think about the following 6 ideas, just to help stimulate their creativity and maybe get them to think about some ideas for the website and also for the posters. So we came up with about 6 ideas for the young people. You can see there 3 of them, and these are the following 3. And we did suggest a visit to the Imperial War Museum. As you've done with this project, it's really important for people to actually go and see the exhibits. You can't touch everything, obviously, but but I think it's a very well laid out exhibition, and it really does stimulate imagination. And we also suggested interviewing friends and family, people within their communities about the contribution of Caribbean soldiers. And we actually gave them tablets so they can actually film interviews with themselves, with their families, and take pictures at the Imperial War Museum, as you guys have done here as well. And that was carried out by BALCK production. So we worked with a filmmaker, some young people who gave the tips to the young people on how to frame everything and how to interview people, and they actually practiced some of those skills within the workshops as well. So this is all still in the first workshop. And then at the end of the first workshop, we left the young people with this question: what do you think people seeing the exhibition and reading the website should know about the role of Jamaican, other Caribbean and Commonwealth soldiers played in World War I? So you can see we were saying to them, you're going to create some posters that will go up on there, and also some information that will go up on the website. Then we came to the second workshop. So there was a sort of time delay between the first workshop where everybody could do their own research, and sort of a week or 2 weeks later we went back to the young people and we said to them, tell us asked them to share us what they found out during their research, showed us what they filmed, and then as a group they decided what should go on the posters, and then our role at the end of this project will be to make sure that we organise a tour of the display panels to go to community centres, libraries and schools throughout London. And then obviously the website is something that's live for anybody to have a look at. So this is just a mock-up at the moment. So we're coming towards the end of our project, and this is just a mock-up of what we think the young people have decided that they want to put on the posters. And then you'll see that for the website, so we've got some content that's ready to go when the website goes live towards the end of November. And that's our project.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Are there any questions that anyone would like to address to Pauline?
I would just like to know what type of audience you had at this workshop, because this is really important. We need to get this going on for people to know what the contribution has been.
I mean, to be honest, we found it quite difficult with the age range between 15 and 22. So we've actually had some younger people and we've had some older people. And we found, because we were a theatre company and we were approaching it from a creative point of view, that the younger people were more engaged if there was sort of a creative outcome to it. So at WACK Arts, there was a week of drama workshops where some of the young people actually used they workshopped excerpts from the play, and the director actually asked them, as your character, how would you write a letter to a friend or family member to let them know you're going off to war, and those sorts of things. So for younger people, it's really about the creative side of things. If there's a sort of a creative element to it, they're a little bit more interested. The sort of family or the adults that came with the young people, they were very much interested in the history and the background to all of the play and why it was put on. So the age range is it's been difficult, I think, but we've managed obviously to have 2 sets of projects going on, well not 2 sets of projects, but to work with 2 different types of groups. So yeah, age range is difficult. So I think it's trying to actually ask young people what do they want out of the workshops, rather than and designing it around them, rather than saying, well, this is what we're going to do, you come along, would you be interested in that?
it's a brilliant new project with many projects like this, and also with Richard earlier speech. My point is, this needs to go beyond that level. It needs to go into schools, primary schools, secondary schools, and if you are planning that, you've got our support. That's one thing I can say. But as it is on its own, we are here. All of us are older generation in my own context. And I've got a 7-year-old that will probably not know what this contribution is. Now, if we don't internalize or give it to them at an early age, this will go somehow back into the archive. And it will take a longer time for it to come back. So in as much as I appreciate and I'm 100% behind it, I believe perhaps you can try and go one step further, taking it to that level, so that this is their history could be in their mind, active and alive. And perhaps that might make a difference with the bigotry and the various other things we experience today. Because once people know the contributions and what people have done over the history and for the empire, perhaps you won't be hearing blacks go back, turn off the light, we need blackouts. Those kind of things might be a thing of the past because we are part of the empire. Thank you for everything there. So that aspect is where we're looking at. Thank you.
Yeah, just a question. My name is Jean-Guy. I would like to know if you tried to ask the young people if there was another war to come, as the world is going now. Do the black people around the world will fight for the ancient colonies, or they will just leave it due to broken promises, lack of respect, everything they have known before? Thank you.
So, the question?
The question is, if the black people would like to fight again, if there was another war to come, due to the broken promises from the empires.
I wouldn't know. Black people. I mean, I have a brother that, my family are originally from Jamaica, and my parents were from Jamaica, and I was born here. I'm in my early 50s. And I have a brother who joined the army, and I have a brother who's in the police. My brother that was in the army joined the British Army as a British citizen, and he was in the army for 22 years. So, and he joined from when he was 16, when you could join at 16, and you had a trade, and that was so for 2 years you had a trade, and then you went into the full army, and he was in the army for 22 years. And I have another brother who's a policeman. So, in terms of those kind of institutions and wanting to be part of the society and being part of those institutions, that was something that they felt that they wanted to do, and that was their calling in a way. So I think it's a very individual choice whether you feel that you would join the army or not, or join the police or something like that. I think it's a very, I don't know if, if you went to Jamaica now, because Jamaica's independent, so...
Well, I mean, it's like they used to force people to go to Jamaica, Barbados, to get the entire community to fight for them if they would have to do that.
Oh gosh, that's a question I couldn't answer, I'm afraid. I mean, they have the Commonwealth, so I don't know. I don't know.
Thank you very much, Pauline. We're going to be moving on to the concluding presentation. As I mentioned, we'll have time after to network, and then you'll be able to engage with each of our speakers, and I'm sure you'll have questions you want to ask there. Just to remind you what Pauline said, this is available here, so if you do want to pick up a copy, please come along.
I should have said it's free.
And it's free.
There's only 14, so...
Yeah, so we've got some here, and I'm sure Pauline, as with Dr. Smith, their contact details will be available for pushing boundaries and really speaking on behalf of the community. Mr. Vavatamba, if you can come forward and give us our conclusion.
So, good afternoon. Thank you very much. My name is Vavatamba. I've been working on and off with KCA, the Congolese Children's Associations, as a volunteer, as a researcher, as a liaisons and everything else for a little over 5 years now. And I wanted to say a huge thank you to all of us for being present and for, essentially because this is a Saturday and not many people are willing, definitely myself, I'm often not willing to come out on a Saturday. One of the essential reasons we organize these kind of things is to tell ourselves our own story, to sort of almost, if you like, boost our own self-esteem, to understand where we come from, our journey, where we are at this point in history, and where it is that we are heading. And I wanted to add a few basic facts in addition to everything that has been said to the role of the West Indies Regiment. If you like, some of the hidden roles of Africans and specifically Congolese soldiers in the World War. One of the factors, essentially, in addition to 1.5 million Africans who were used as porters, 2 million Africans took part in the First World War. And this is a crucial element. The first shot against the German soldiers during the First World War and the first victory against the Germans, and the last German soldiers to have surrendered in the First World War did not happen in Europe or in other parts of the world. It happened in Africa. It's really crucial that we remember that those basic fact. And that was in Tanganyika, so the first shot was fired in Tanganyika, Tanzania, which has been mentioned. The first victory was Togo, which Benedict and Kevin have already talked about. And the last surrender happened, of course, also around Zambia. And amazingly, Congolese soldiers played a crucial role in securing those few basic things. Another crucial element is, as many of you would know, Congo was, this goes to the question the gentleman asked about Brexit. First World War was fought because the German had invaded a neutral Belgium, which is crucial. So the British went to war against the German, and there were a few other reasons, but that was, if you like, the trigger. Second World War was fought again because the British had said to the German, do not invade Poland, and the Germans went and invaded Poland, and then we declared war against the Germans. And we found ourselves in a tricky situation in which Britain is refusing access to the very people, Ethiopian, Polish, and so forth, whom Britain had went to war to defend and to fight. It's an interesting dilemma, in terms of history. You ask yourself, well, if Britain can do that to the Polish, God knows what it is that the vice side of the Conservative Party and the UK will do to people who look like me. So that's another element I wanted to add in bracket. Another crucial element is the Somme has been mentioned by Kevin and Benedict, and it's interesting that 75%, white people did most of the dying in the Somme, in Passchendaele, and so forth. But in terms of the casting price, bullets that were used in those killings, 75% of them were made using Congolese cobalt. So our contribution to that war was incredibly crucial, incredibly gigantic. So we need to remember all of this, and we also need to remember that black people have been involved in essentially every single European conflict, almost since the Crimea. And there are also evidence that we were involved before the Crimea. So with that in mind, I want to say another thank you to all of you. To younger people, remember this, you did not simply fall from the sky, you played a crucial role in the history of the world. And where we found ourselves, especially in the Congolese context, this is also really, really interesting. If you remember, so the Berlin Conference divided Africa, and then First World came, and then we divided Africa for the second time. And this is interesting for the Congolese perspective because, as you know, Tanzania was a German colony, and Cameroon, a German colony. But of course, I'm coming to that point. Rwanda and Burundi were German colony, and what happened was because of the First World War, Rwanda and Burundi were given to the Belgians as a compensation. because Germany had inflicted so much crimes against the Belgians here in Europe. There's a compensation for all the suffering that you have endured. You can have one in Burundi, and the same goes for Cameroon. It was divided between the French and the British, but of course now it's one country. Tanzania again, and Namibia and so forth. So it played an incredible role in our history and our identity, and of course African economy. So keep that in mind, and as we move forward, let's keep on striving and let's keep on moving forward. Thank you so much, and join us for lunch. And if you're interested in KCA, please speak to me at the end. We are looking for volunteers. Speak to the gentleman at the back of Angoma, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
But before you go, how can anyone get in touch with you for?
Oh, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, on every social media you can think about. Baba Tampa, you'll easily find me. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So as concluding notes, just to say thank you all for obviously coming here and sharing this time. We hope that it was beneficial. We appreciate the feedback and comments that you'll be able to give us. Baba's put himself forward, he will be around. Mr. Barton will be around. Benedict is around. Kelvin is around. I mean, there's our young volunteers. By the way, if you didn't see them, if we could just give them a round of applause as well, because they did run this project. And I've got a note here because this project was actually nominated and will feature in a bigger presentation which is taking place on the 2nd of November. There is detail and information with Mr. Barton. You can see him for that, but this is one of the projects that will be presented at this event. So please come forward and we'll give you more information on that. You can register. It's the 2nd of November, and the address, we'll be able to provide it again, but it's Woodburn House Conference Centre in Tavistock Square in WC1. I think that's central London. Yeah. So we've got the information. Please come and see either Rava or Mr. Bartgoma or Benedict or Kelvin again, and we'll be able to provide you with that information. I think we have refreshments set up. Yes. Mr. Bartgoma, do you want to come and just give the last conclusion?
No, you've done everything. So, half of applause for the young men and the young girls.
We are so happy, you know, the next generation is coming. We've done so much since 2002 to now. How many years? 15 years I've been volunteering, so I think I have to retire now. Hopefully people are there to take over. So I feel very happy. It's the first time I've been sitting during an event, the first ever time. So, you know, I think that's the way we go forward.